Hello, everyone, and welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics in games, how they work, and why we love them. I am always Anonymous Wombat, and with me is my co-host, Mark.
Hello, everyone.
I'm not always Anonymous Wombat. I am Anonymous Wombat this week, which is one of my favorites. I actually wrote a story when I was a child about wombats. I don't think I even knew what they were. I just thought it was a really funny word. And
yeah, that's a pretty specific animal.
I know, exactly. I didn't even know how I knew what it was. It was, what was his name? Something the Chunky Wombat. I thought the phrase Chunky Wombat was just the funniest thing in the world.
It's not like one of those animals you learn during the alphabet, you know? Like,
so the W was always taken up by Wolverine.
Of course, so, yeah. We were very proud of our Wolverines.
Yeah, you mean the animal that barely exists in our state?
Yeah, but we're still proud of it.
Yeah, I know.
We killed the Wolverine, guys. It's our state.
Yeah, we... Okay, so today we're actually going to get right into it, as hopefully normal. But this one I'm super excited about because I have a lot to talk about. But we series on 2D, 3D last week, and what may actually be a tiny series, depending on, we have so much to talk about, we might end up doing multiple episodes on this.
There might be an overflow.
Exactly. We might do a sequel to the sequel. We're basically going to do series today, or how games move from not only within their own system, but literally from title to title, and how they improve, and what makes a good series or a good sequel, and what makes a bad one. And in large part, this is an easier one in terms of I've just played a lot of games, and there's a lot of series out there, so Mark and I are going to be able to just draw on our favorite series and talk about them. You'll probably have heard us talk about these before. Although I'm going to venture into one of my favorite series, which I haven't talked about much here, which is BioShock. And pretty much go through the case studies of what were the good sequels and which were the better ones and the not so good ones. And are going to touch on what makes that good in a bigger sense, but also a bizarre little quirk that we found in terms of, well, I think this is true for a lot of things, but just particularly in trilogies, the second game being the best in a lot of the series we were talking about,
right?
And why that might be. So to start with, actually, this comes back to Mark I just pointed this out that I've been talking about Darksiders a lot because I've been playing it. It's a series probably little known. It's kind of unique aesthetic in terms of, it's kind of Diablo-esque in terms of heaven, hell, humans, and the war between all of them. But it started. The first one is basically a Zelda God of War-esque RPG dungeon action game, and then the second one, the reason that we were thinking about this is the second one is really different in terms of the progression system. Like I said, the first one's very, very straightforward in terms of you collect souls, you kill things, collect souls, currency, basically, very God of War in terms of when you kill things, you get a resource that then allows you to upgrade your movesets. Your character doesn't revel, you don't really have skill trees, you don't really have attribute points or gear or anything like that. It's just pretty straightforward. And actually, really enjoy this. It's so simple. And then the second one they did was all of those things I just mentioned. You suddenly have gear that you can collect. You still have those currency, but you don't upgrade things with it. You buy things. So you can buy gear, you can buy potions. You have 2 skill trees that you can invest points in, as you have a leveling system, which you don't have in the first Darksiders. So a lot of huge differences from 2, which in large part, I think that one actually got close to a big thing that seems very important with series is maintaining this identity of the game, right? Being able to jump into the game and literally being able to be like, oh, this is very clearly from this series, feels like the last one, or the thing that I really liked. And in large part, Darksiders 1, the aesthetic is really unique and I really like it, and obviously that was maintained. But in large, I think so Darksiders got pretty darn close to hitting the not great side of that, to feeling like an entirely different thing because of the difference in the progression. It's now open world as opposed to being hub-based as it was in Darksiders 1. So they really, really pushed the envelope, and ironically, this is something that basically we're going to be talking about, is I think in large part a good thing, and the goal of a good sequel or a good series, which is not just doing more of the thing that worked the first time, but iterating and actually understanding what really made the game good, and then doing something different, but still in that same vein, which is very, very difficult. And I think Darksiders is an interesting example in terms of they actually almost went too far and just made a different game, almost a different sub-genre. I will say I don't think I think it was excellent. I'm glad they did. I'm really excited for the third one. because if there's one thing I hate, it's just lazy sequels that just do the same thing as the last game, and Darksiders were in no danger of doing that. Like I said, if anything, they actually might have even gone too far in the other direction. The two games are so different, it's hard to compare them, right? It's hard to say which one's strictly better because they tried to do such different things.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me when games start almost slipping into a different genre because they've done so much different. Like, if you look between Dead Space 1 and 3, they're completely different games.
Yeah,
and you can understand how you got there if you played 2, but just taking the two games like separately, one feels more like a survival horror, the other one feels more like a first-person shooter, almost Halo-esque.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why people didn't like where the Darksiders franchise went was because, Darksiders, good lord, the Dead Space. What's up with all the DSs? Darksiders, Dark Souls, Dead Space.
It's a very good point.
That's about it, actually.
Those are that's
apparently almost 3's too much.
Almost every game has a DS in the title. If
exactly,
you look close enough. Like Mario
the
Kart DS.
Exactly. All right. Anyway, and that's why people didn't like where Dead Space went, was because they lost sight of exactly what was good about the series, which was at that point that the first Dead Space was so cool because it was a brilliant take on survival horror with a really unique combat mechanic, which was, instead of just shooting things, was very precise slicing of things, which they nailed, and was really fun. And a big part of it was that you didn't have any huge, gigantic battles. You weren't this space marine. You were literally just an engineer who had his fusion cutter, and you had to be creative to get through a horrible situation. And then eventually you just became a space marine, basically. And that wasn't as fun.
Yeah, ironically. But it's... I think, and this was a theme that will keep coming up, it does show that when you just try to enhance the player character, especially in a genre like survival horror, it can do some weird things to your sequels. Because in survival horror, you're really not supposed to be enhanced as a player character. But if you want to...
let's talk about... that's a great point. So let's talk about just briefly narrative, too, in terms of... Because there's different ways to do this. There's all different kinds of sequels, right? There's the straight up like narrative and gameplay sequels. Like I'm going to talk a lot about Arkham, the Arkham series, which I haven't played Knight, so I can't speak to that. But I have played, the absolute balls out of Asylum, and then City, and then the kind of mid sequel Origins, which was not done by Rocksteady, but was done by WB Montreal. So that's another interesting case study and exactly why sequels go well sometimes and don't in others. So you have games like that where it's narrative. Then you have weird side, like we'll talk about, say, the or other examples of that would be like Jak and Daxter, the Ratchet and Clank games, Sly Cooper, kind of that whole era of PS2 games. But then you have like weird other one, like so Darksiders is actually is a it never advances you play the same exact time period as a different character in the second game, and you'll be doing the same thing in the third game, where you're going around seeing what everyone's doing at this time span instead of moving the narrative forward. So that's one way to do it. Or there's, like games don't really have a narrative where they live in this in between, like Mario, right? Like you don't, and it doesn't matter, right? You care about that. You just enter into exactly anything could be happening, really. It's the beginning of a Mario game, and you're like, all right, that's fine. Like,
right? It's pretty much
could be around, it could be stolen.
It's Mario, a super thin veil over like go through some levels as Mario now. Like,
exactly. Yeah,
it's like Mario captured or Bowser captured Peach for like the 1,000th time. It's like you don't care. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, no one's angry about that. They're redoing the same thing.
Right.
Because that's not the point of Mario games. So the other two really weird ones that are super, super popular, but are bizarre in terms of their series, are, which I have less, I'll let Mark talk about this, but are the Final Fantasy series and Zelda. Because those games are beloved, obviously some of the most popular games of all time, and most successful and best, and also complete, like, cluster monks to try to figure out what in the world is happening sequentially. I literally haven't for all of my nerddom and game love, I have no idea how those stories work. Like I have zero idea.
Well,
Final Fantasy is a little bit different in terms of, we'll talk about it.
Yeah, I was gonna say get ready because I'm gonna explain it a little bit.
Here we go. Drop some knowledge.
So for Zelda, that's really the interesting one. Final Fantasy, basically they're all separate stories between the numerals. So you've got Final Fantasy 7 and 8 are going to be completely different stories. But Final Fantasy, 10 and 10-2 are sequels. Or 13 and 13-2, or
Right.
so they have a different naming scheme for sequelizing the individual worlds, which is just kind of a interesting scheme for naming. Very flexible though. Good for them.
But it's so interesting that it's worked too. Is the fact that, like you said, in terms of generally with series, the reason you come back to them is to either see the rest of the story or because you love the characters so much. And Final Fantasy is a hard reset every single time.
Right.
Other
It's
than you said,
it's
the
more
sequels.
in the vein of something like Mario where you retain a lot of the mechanics. I mean, if
Right.
you compare Final Fantasy 1 to Final Fantasy 15, they are completely
I
different
mean, yeah,
games.
that's
But if you play them sequentially, you'll see a very slow shift in the mechanics that allow the core base to still enjoy and participate in those games. And there was a pretty major break between 10 and I think 12. 11 was
yeah,
online, where they
yeah,
switched from doing turn-based to real-time.
right,
Um,
right.
but that's probably the
But
biggest
it's just
mechanical
interesting.
shift.
It speaks to that's a very difficult thing to do. I think it speaks to the how good Square Enix is in large part to being able to not have to rely on just characters or narrative, but really a incredibly good and iterative gameplay system that they did over and over, as well as like even just aesthetically the feel, right? Like there's certain themes to Final Fantasy games you can just recognize, like, hey, this is
Yeah,
Final Fantasy.
there is
And
like
they
a loose
there's a very
amount of world building. Like there's returning characters. You've got, Chocobos are in multiple games. Moogles
right,
are in multiple games. Like they have different races and things that show up between the games, even though they don't explain how the worlds are connected. It's a bit more like a D&D multiverse in that way.
yeah,
Like there are sort of classic D&D monsters, but you can be in, many, many different realms.
right, and I think this will go into kind of our main thesis for this whole thing, but it seems like the developers really understand what makes a Final Fantasy game good and what makes Final Fantasy, and they have a very deep understanding of that core concept, and hence can do different things with it and still have it feel good and be successful.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and that's so important for sequels. And for
Right.
Zelda, there is
Yeah,
more
so go to Zelda.
relationship between the games. Like, I'm not going to nail this because I haven't studied extensively, and if somebody's like a major Zelda fan, they probably would understand the timeline a bit better than me.
Shed Xander on here.
But yeah, right. But they are connected. There's a lot of parallel timelines going on in the Zelda games. There's basically a split in the timeline between I believe it's the Four Swords, Ocarina of Time, actually. So you've got a split between where the hero is triumphant and where the hero is defeated. And then you've got another split in the triumphant timeline of when Link is a child and when he's an adult, because he can do time travel in the Ocarina of Time.
Right.
So those are the
Was that
two.
intentional? Like, did it start that way? Like, because I felt like the Zelda games, because there were Zelda games before Ocarina, obviously, were they completely just iterative at that point, or were they like narratively connected, or how did they work up until then? Do you know?
You mean like when Zelda, like the very early Zelda games, like the very first ones?
Yeah.
So it started off as all the early games are in the defeated hero, what is now called the defeated hero timeline. So that's A
Okay.
Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, The Legend of Zelda proper, like the very
Right.
first one. The Adventure of Link, those are all in the hero defeated timeline, which
Right.
is to say it follows after in Ocarina of Time you lose to Ganon.
Right.
And then
So it's post basically, yeah. The games as they were developed chronologically weren't not. This is all post. It was like postscript as in terms
Yeah.
of they wrote it
and
backwards.
arguably just retconned by the community trying to fit the games
Yeah.
together. But they make pretty good arguments. They hint at other games in the development
Okay.
of the new games. So it's like you can kind of make an argument for a consistent world. Anyway,
It's just very interesting in terms of with Zelda as opposed to Final Fantasy. Like we said, if there is a sequel, then it's numbered differently, as well as it's very clear that it's the same characters and time has moved. If it's not between the numerals, it's a whole different worlds. The different thing with Zelda is that you literally have the same exact characters in different times and different
Right.
situations and ages.
And you're sort of like filling in random gaps in the timeline. Like
Exactly.
they make no promises that it's going to be after the end of even one of these particular forks. Like they might insert one right in the middle of one of the forks, and that's just
yeah, exactly. Or do an entirely different fork at some point if they wanted to. Or
right, exactly.
like I have no idea where Breath of the Wild is or what it's about. Played it, seen it. Absolutely zero.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty good game. I mean, it's set up like an open world game, but I forget where exactly if it's in the timeline.
Exactly.
And so that's an important
hugely
part.
Successful.
Yeah, like it's not really a narrative sequel. Like because it's so jumping, there's so much jumping around. You don't play a Zelda game because you think it's going to tell you more about what happened in Ocarina of Time.
Right.
Like at least I think most 99% of the player base doesn't do that.
Or to see where Link's character arc ends, right? Or how Zelda's going to develop this game. Like that's not the draw.
Right. It toes the line between almost like comic book style resets that I'm going to talk about in a minute, and more linear narratives like I guess Darksiders isn't really a great example, but something like the Arkham games where it's just like, okay, now we move forward in time.
Right, yeah. Or, yeah, I mean, probably most other episodic games like that. Yeah, let's talk about, like, that more, like, on the side of, like, like Donkey Kong, Mario. Honestly, a lot of the Nintendo games are more kind of comic booky in terms of, like, the reset portion. Like you said, like, with Mario, like, you don't care what the situation is. You're into it, and you see the characters, and it doesn't really... why does that work for those games, specifically?
Yeah.
Why does it fail for other games?
Well, I don't know if I'm ready to talk about the failure question yet. We can think about that. But
I don't think we actually answered that question in our prep.
But why it works, I think, is because, like you said, they've recognized what makes their games lovable, and they've set the expectation that there's not going to be narrative progression. Like, I think you really have to do both of those things really early on. So, like, with Mario... there was never really a picking up there was never a sense that there was going to be a narrative progression in the Mario games. Not from what I remember. The characters, you can kind of connect them, and you probably could make a timeline for Mario games if you really wanted to. But they don't set up an expectation that you're learning more about Mario's life, because Mario's kind of supposed to be this everyman, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, he's generic.
Yeah, very much so.
And so, and with the Donkey Kong characters, there is a little bit of like narrative progression between Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, and 3. Okay, but you get... So, I mean, the basic narrative is the Kongs get their bananas stolen, so they have to get them back from K. Rool. And then K. Rool captures Donkey Kong. And then Diddy teams up with his cousin to go rescue Donkey Kong. And then Diddy and Donkey both get captured in the third one by K. Rool, and Dixie has to team up with her other cousin, Cuddly. So it's just like that's basically the timeline. So you don't really get much narrative. They played around with a bit more of a narrative in the third one. There was just more dialogue than there ever was in the other two games.
Is there any power? At the end of it, I literally have not played these games, and I know I'm so sorry. But at the end of a DK game, are you more powerful than you were at the beginning? Have you gained new abilities?
Nope. There are no abilities in the. Okay. They played around with that in Donkey Kong 64, but in Donkey Kong Country series, it's all just platforming straight up. You jump on things and you get better at doing that, Mario. And things get harder.
And it's interesting. The other thing that avoids, or the other pitfall of sequels that avoids, which I guess it's a fun time to talk about it, is like, so having that episodic thing with Mario, both narratively and power-wise, right? At the end of like Super Mario Galaxy, you have all these different abilities that you did not have. And then you come into any other Mario game, and you don't have those abilities, and you're not like, oh, what the heck, at the end of Galaxy, Mario could like fly between planets. You don't think that, right? That's just not something that occurs to you, and it doesn't feel wrong, it doesn't feel like there's a large amount of dissonance there.
Right.
And it's the exact same reason, I think, is that you have this entire expectation of you don't need, because the narrative isn't coherent, or the timeline isn't connected, you don't need him to be the same power level, which is not true for a narrative series.
Right.
Which we'll use God of War for this example. A series that's notorious for having to figure out new and creative ways to depower you at the beginning of each game. Because at the end of God of War, you're literally a god. So
before
that
before talking about God of War, I do want to make a point that in Mario, even in the like very early Mario games, you're like you go into pipes and you come out somewhere else. Right. Like, so what's the real difference between doing that and jumping into a painting like you do in Mario 64, or going to a different planet like you do in Mario Galaxy? Like, it's just they've already made the system so absurd that they can kind of do what they want.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Is that they and you as the player aren't like, what? Like, this seems like this doesn't seem right, or like this seems like a major breach of my belief.
Right.
Like, no, you've been traveling around. God knows what even is it? The world flat? It's very unclear how the pipe system works. Who built that?
Exactly.
And the physics behind it. You know, like that's a great point. You're precisely right. God of War, on the other hand, does try to build a completely coherent narrative. And I'll only talk about the main sequence games 1, 2, and 3, because that's in large part all these two. But like I said, at the end of God of War 1, you have actually become the God of War. And you start God of War 2. Actually, the intro mission is you going down and helping. You're you're a Spartan, so you're the patron of Sparta, and they're invading Rhodes. And you're coming to help. So sometimes you just come and murder things because it's fun. And so literally the opening mission of God of War 2, you are a god and you get to just murder. Like it's pretty straightforward and it's pretty fun. Couldn't stay there though. That wouldn't be too fun for the entire game, or it wouldn't be a great game. So in that game you literally have more spoilers for the God of War series here. Sorry, it's a decade old. More so, it's like 15 years old. But you. They do it very well in this sense, in that they actually pull your depowering into the narrative. So the whole point of 2 is the fact that the conflict is between you and Zeus. Zeus is terrified that you're gonna rise up and kill him the same way he killed his father. You're also his son, and classic Greek mythology. And so what he does in the beginning mission is basically tricks you into giving all your power into this sword and then stealing the sword. So you depower yourself, basically. Very clever. It sets you back to mortal status. Suddenly you have a hill to climb. Mm-hmm. You need to get some of your stuff back. Gameplay-wise, of course, now you actually have to try and have to be creative, and there's upgrades and yada, yada, yada. But also narratively, it set up the entire conflict. So it's a very elegant way of doing that.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
God of War 3, not so much. It's similar. At the end of God of War 2, you basically have reached god status again. You have the blade that killed all of the Titans, and you're riding a Titan to come kill all of the gods at Mount Olympus. So
power level riding a Titan.
I know, exactly. Like, the God of War games are such great examples because they sound so ludicrous. You literally rip off the god of the sun's head and then carry his head around for the rest of the game and use it as a lantern to find stuff. Like it's brilliant. It's fantastic. But anyway, so 3, you basically, what happens? You get knocked off the Titan, and you fall all the way down Mount Olympus into Hades, and then you're in the river Styx, and a bunch of dead guys come and drain all your powers. And you get out, and you manage to get out of the Styx, and then you have to. So that one's far less narrative, as well as far less elegant, I would say, in terms of its reasoning.
Right.
But effectively the same.
Well, because I think one of the reasons why that is less satisfying is because it shows your player character failing at something, but you weren't involved in that failure. Like it feels like it's punishing you.
Right? You do everything right during the opening.
Right, and then you still get punished.
Lightning at you and you fall. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a really good point. Is that and as opposed to, like I said, the God of War 2 is so elegant in that you make the choice several times to drain your power into that sword, so you can get the power to kill this enemy, basically, and then you get tricked and realize that, oh crap, I did all this, and then Zeus comes down and snot out of you and actually stabs you with the same sword. So it's very elegant in that regard. I think that depowering thing also gets more and more difficult the more you try. Like it becomes harder and harder to justify that, and I think that even becomes apparent. Like, so obviously the first time they do that, God of War 2, pretty darn elegant, pretty cool, pretty narratively cohesive, makes sense. God of War 3, less so. It's still it all fits, it all makes sense. It follows, but it's not quite as integrated. And then God of War Ascension, which is kind of, you can think of the fourth one. There were 2 other mobile games actually they did: Chains of Olympus and Ghost of Sparta, I think. which are prequel. But anyway, Ascension is actually a prequel to 1. And at that point, they really don't even bother explaining why you are the way you are, or why at the end of this game you aren't as powerful as you are in 1. Like they pretty much just give up. And I think that's because it is more difficult to, as you expand the canon of your game and the timelines and the narrative, it becomes harder and harder, particularly with a prequel where you have to work backwards, to be able to justify all these different changes, as well as just eventually it gets tiresome. It's like, okay, really, like, for a God of War game, eventually you have to get to the point where you're strong enough to kill a god or a mythological creature of roughly equivalent status.
Right.
And it is actually very difficult, and the God of War series actually is pretty darn narrative-based. It actually has some cool character work that it does, and does become very tiresome to power up and then depower this character like 6 times. To the point where he is powerful enough to kill Ares, and then powerful enough to kill, it's I think Persephone at one point, the Fates,
yeah,
and then the Furies, and then Zeus again. So anyway, all that to say, I think that gets harder the more times you try to do it.
I think you're absolutely right.
Necessarily.
And I think that's one of the reasons why comic books have eventually started doing a very similar... That's why I've been calling these comic book style resets, is because I think they really pioneered this idea of like reusing a character, but in a way that's completely disconnected from a previous timeline. The quintessential example would be, the death of Superman, and then they brought him back, right? Like, everybody thought that, like, okay, so you can't continue that timeline, right? And they're like, no, we're not going to continue the timeline, but he's back anyway. And
yeah, exactly. And that's kind of what they're doing with even the new God of War, right? The reboot of the entire series.
Right.
It's been a long time since 3. Ascension, I think, was like 2013, maybe. Still, long time, and they are literally pretty much doing the same thing. Actually, last time we saw Kratos at the end of God of War 3, he got stabbed through his abdomen's gone. It's ridiculous. Like the sword is so large that it leaves a gaping hole in his whole torso.
Oh my gosh.
Last of this, we see him, and then he's bleeding out, and then we see a blood smear to the edge of a cliff. So we don't see his body. So, definitely dead, right? Like, no possible way he could survive that. And yet, here we are back 5 years later with him, and it's a new setting, right? There's all kinds of... I don't know how much they're going to connect the 2 series. I don't know if they even have to. He has a son now, all this kind of stuff. So, I think it's a good example of that comic book-esque reset, where you're like, no, we're just going to... It's back, and that's okay. And for the God of War games, in large part, that worked out. I mean, I think the reason they did do a hard reset here is that, one, they were literally running out of mythological creatures to kill from Greek mythology. Like, you literally kill the entire pantheon in God of War 3. And, so let's go to the Norse. But at the same time, there was some level, I think, of that dreaded series fatigue that was happening. And a new God of War game was coming out every other year, and you were doing largely the same thing, and even the narrative was getting tired, and they needed to figure something else out. So they did. So we'll see how the new one is. I mean, that's another one. Beloved series. I love those games. There's the first M game I ever owned. It was very important for my breakthrough into like adult gaming, basically.
Greek mythology.
Yeah. And Greek, honestly, there's a big part of it. I
know
a lot of Greek mythology because of those games. Literally, like, it's so funny. Even in God of War 2, before you're just killing gods, you kill other famous Greek heroes.
Right.
So, like, I almost can't think of a Greek character that hasn't showed up in those games that you haven't brutalized and murdered very, very painfully.
Yeah, they really went through all their source material there. And you can't really, like, add stuff to the Greek pantheon, right? You can't be like, there's a new god.
Yeah, there's a new character. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, they did that with Kratos, but that was literally...
Yeah, that's the one exception.
That was the one they got. So, in any case, this, I think, brings us to a decent point in the episode, just in terms of the middle round here of... This is one of the times where we actually did kind of have a work thesis coming into it as opposed to discovering it as we talked.
Yeah.
And this one's largely based around the Arkham series and why Arkham City was so good, and then why Arkham Origins was not quite as good. And like I said, I can't speak to Knight. I've managed to not spoil that game for myself for years and years, so I'm going to keep that going. But in large part, I think what I have found from playing so much of City and Asylum, and there are people out there that think that Asylum's better, and I get that. It does do one thing better, in my opinion, which is atmosphere. It's very different in that regard. But in large part, Arkham City is pretty much better in every way, in my opinion. And the reason that is that it doesn't fall into even what some of the later God of War games fell into, what Call of Duty is notorious for, what Assassin's Creed is notorious for, any serialized game series, which is basically just the bigger, badder, more-ness.
Right.
Take exactly the same thing and give you more of it. It doesn't do that. In fact, it does give you more necessarily in terms of the map's bigger and there's more moves that you can do. But it evolves, I think is the best way to put it. It doesn't just take all the things from Arkham Asylum and do the same thing but bigger. Changes the game and, like I said, understood the things that were really good about Arkham Asylum, which were its combat, its exploration, and its Predator missions, the stealth portions. And then, of course, the story, and it expanded those things. It strictly expanded them. It didn't just take the same system and do something else with it, which is exactly what happened in Origins. Actually, Origins is basically Arkham City 2.0 kind, or like 1.5, I'd say, where it doesn't feel like an evolution. It feels like City with more stuff in it. Exactly what I was talking about, and it's not as satisfying, and it wasn't as good, honestly. And there's all kinds of examples I could give if we have time to do that. But even specifically, it kind of requires you to know the Arkham games a bit. But in large part, like I said, I think this comes back to a very deep understanding of what made that first game very, very good. And the ability to push that creatively, not just be like, okay, let's do this again. But understanding and actually giving more of that thing, which is very, very hard to do, I would maintain.
So I have a question for you, especially as somebody who isn't a huge fan of just remaking the same game. Do you think there is ever a place for saying, people loved this story, we like the mechanics that we put in it, and we're just going to make basically an expansion of the first game? Would that be more of just an expansion, or how do you think that they should do that?
What would that be?
Yeah, well, just
or can that even be done well?
Yeah, if you literally just want to add more narrative to the game you already made.
Yeah, at that point, I call that an expansion, for sure.
Yeah,
I think that's, like, almost by definition. A lot of things that you see sequel mechanically to, or in general, time is gone, and you'll have, like, a new system, a new engine, something different about, like, just the way it was developed. So, like, literally the same exact game with just more narrative. I mean, that's, like, story expansion. That's just... those were expansion packs.
Right.
Back in the day for PC, that would have been like story DLC in the era before
loot boxes.
So yeah, I honestly call that expansion. I mean, same thing with Skyrim had 3 paid expansions where it was more story, and it was literally the exact same system, the same games.
Right. So there does seem to be a mechanical element to sequels, like almost as a prerequisite to being a sequel.
Yeah, like we were talking about earlier with Darksiders, how there need to be something new in terms of the system itself too, to keep you interested.
What you mentioned about the Arkham Asylum games, like, I think it's so funny how different mediums end up discovering very similar things. And what I was thinking of when you were talking was Magic the Gathering, and how they have managed to constantly add to their canon of cards without it just becoming a total mess or a power creep or making older cards irrelevant. And the way that they've done that is through adding different things, first of all, but also putting new things in and taking old things out. And sort of having a rolling window of like, okay, these are the things that you can use right now. And
which is interesting. The equivalent of that in games is basically, like we said, that like power reset or the change. Like in the case of Darksiders, it was entire dynamics of the way that they did the leveling system or the progression system. In Arkham, the progression system is the same, but you don't have you don't have, some of the gadgets are different, right? You don't have some of the exact same puzzles. They keep a few of them, but in large part just expand upon new things. So you do have to, I think there is an interesting part that you do have to like eliminate something from like, I think that also goes into bloat, right? Like if you keep everything and just keep on adding, then it's not as streamlined an experience. It's not as kind of pure and lean. And so, you do, even in sequels, you have to remove certain things. And that's what you see, I think, across the board. And with God of War games, the secondary weapon system changed from 2 to 3. You didn't have secondary weapons, really. You just had versions of the same weapon.
And I think
they couldn't keep everything.
That's the more that you're talking about, right? Is like when you just add something. So I think you're right to point out, like, something's got to give. You've got to take something out. But I think that's one of the hardest places for game designers to be, where they have got to understand their game so well that they know what could have been taken out of the first game, and it still would have felt like that game. Yeah, like, that's such a hard question to answer.
It's a great point. I mean, it's kind of that classic, like, cutting things away until it's down to the purest form.
Right, because I think that's where you have to start, harder,
right? And it's so much scarier moving something, right? Like if you don't have a great understanding of why this game worked, then you're like, no, it's not. We can't take anything away from it because I don't understand which block I'm taking away. You know, what if everything collapses under this?
Right, exactly, and that can happen. Like we saw that in the Battlefront series. You know, I would argue a major block that they took away was having you be more powerful than the surrounding units.
Yeah.
You know, they took that out. So.
and to pretty extreme detriment. Or the idea of very, very free-form playing, it being very easy to be able to play in almost any way, shape, or form. Being able to just spawn in as any type of trooper, being able to jump into vehicles, not even to earn, like, whereas I guess you had to earn a little bit, but...
Right.
That was, like, like, the way they sold on the box, too, was, like, fight the battle any way you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
They missed that, honestly. That's a great... I want to talk about, like, I mean, we move into the fact that I think this works, at least for now, the idea that we're talking is really, really hard to do that, right? To take, particularly if the first game was good, and usually you need the first game to be good to get a sequel out of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Arkham Asylum was a masterpiece, right? It's brilliant. So how do you take a step forward from that, right? Like, how do you make something as good and better? It has to be both those things. It can't just be better than the first one. It's got to be all the things that you loved from the first one too. Super, super hard, super scary. I maintain, and so this goes back to that thing, like you said, as we were talking about games, a lot of times we actually found the second game was the best in the series. With the Arkham series, I would say Jak and Daxter, Ratchet and Clank, like Cooper. I think most people consider Darksiders 2 to be the top of Dark Souls 2 to be the top of the chain there. Uncharted, another series. Red Alert, one of my favorite RTS series. And so on and so forth of trilogies anyway. Mass Effect, another great example. And we were thinking about why that is, and I think it might just be part of, it is so, particularly like I said, all those games, all those series were really good to start, right? Jak and Daxter, the original was fantastic, Ratchet and Clank, Sly Cooper. Uncharted 1 was fantastic, Red Alert 1 was brilliant, Mass Effect 1 was groundbreaking. It's so hard to go from that. I think you can basically, there might be some limit, some reality limit in game design, which is like you can only do that so many times where you iterate. Like you can basically, if you have a good enough game, you can only make it better once. And then you have to figure something else out, you know?
Well, think about how in our current discussion, think about how that's going to work theoretically, right? So you take the first game, you've got to strip something down and add something to make the second game, right?
Right.
So now we're at the second game, you've got to do the same thing, right? If you're going to make another sequel, you've got to take the second game, you treat it like the first game. So you've got to take something out of the second game. It can't be the thing that you just added in though, because now you're making a sequel to the first game, not the second game.
Right, exactly. And you can't go back to anything you used from the first game necessarily.
Right, exactly. And so you have to find, unless you had a game that had a few things that could have been taken out originally, then it's going to be really hard to make a second and a third and a fourth game. Exactly.
And that's I think that's exactly it. You can't, without basically Uncharted 3 and 4, so very, very similar. You can't, unless you're adding game modes or something like that. And we're mostly talking about single player games here too. It basically it compounds upon itself, right? If you're thinking about a series as the winnowing of an idea of a game idea, a game design idea, and each iteration is slightly closer to what the perfect version of that is, you can only do that so many times until you're reaching something resembling the best version of that idea, right?
And so the alternative, I would say the alternative is you do start cutting into the core of the game and you actually have a slow drift in the genre of the game, which we do see in some series, where you do take out things that actually are core to the experience, but that's because you're okay with altering the experience at that point.
Right, Zelda being a good example of that, right? With Breath of the Wild being a evolution of the entire experience, right? Like
Right.
it even when I was talking about like Zelda games in general is like that idea of like kind of the dungeons and the collectibles and having a leveling system. Now you have all these different things with gear, certainly the open world, the asymmetry of the way it's played, and that was because they needed. I think they needed to do that. How many Zelda games have there been? A dozen.
At least, yeah. There's been a lot on a lot of different platforms. And so I think they're more okay with sacrificing some of what makes a classic Zelda game because they can, and because they need to. They need to keep evolving and moving the series forward. Yeah. And they don't have anything where they can just take it out and have it be strictly an improvement.
Yeah. And I think, so a great, here's another good example of this idea even. I love when all of our ideas come together, Mark. It feels so nice. It means that there's good ideas if they come organically like this. BioShock being a really good example of actually this very thing, which was BioShock 1 was obviously considered a masterpiece, and was it was very fresh, very new, in almost every regard in terms of its narrative. That was one of the very first games, maybe not one of the first, but one of the big games when you talk about video games is art. And the potential for that, the progression systems. Then we have BioShock 2. Had the very not enviable place of having to try to follow up the first game, and it was fine. It was good. It in large part was good because BioShock 1 was good. It didn't really evolve. It didn't iterate. It basically did the thing. Honestly, it was more of BioShock 1. And the narrative wasn't as tight and wasn't quite as good too. That was a big part of it. But also gameplay wise, they basically just added more stuff. And you were in the exact same place, so you were in Rapture, this setting that was just adored. Everyone loved it. It was so original, so cool, so unique, an underwater dystopia from the 50s. And so they did that again, basically. And it was a direct sequel to the first one, and it, like I said, it didn't work. It didn't reach the same echelons. It certainly was not better than the first one.
Right.
And then you have a third game, basically, which was not a sequel. It was not BioShock 3. It was BioShock Infinite, which was obviously the same guys, all the same team. And Infinite is considered as good, if not, some people have considered it better than the original, which is precisely because they had to leave. Basically, I don't think they quite succeeded in even doing what we were talking about originally, which was like winnowing the idea of BioShock 1 down to a better version, which might have been because they actually had reached that the first time, right? Like, I wonder if there is some level, if you make a good enough game, you can't make a sequel, like a direct sequel.
Right.
Because you actually did nail, like, they killed that idea. Like, they got the best version of that idea, basically. And they tried to do it again, and it just wasn't as good, because I think they nailed it the first time.
Right.
Infinite, they took it to an entirely new setting. You weren't in Rapture anymore. It wasn't a direct sequel. It was still in the same timeline, universe, obviously, and had all the things that made a BioShock game feel like BioShock. Particularly in terms of the narrative, the weirdness, the weird dystopian stuff, the historical things, the combination of the gameplay was the same, a lot of morality, really, really interesting twists and turns, and of course the art style was very similar, but it was completely new, and they took it to a completely different place, and they needed to, I think, because of, like, exactly what we were talking about, and in doing so, achieved something on par with their first game.
Right, but different.
So again, exactly, wildly different, right? Rapture is literally under the entire ocean, and everything's dark, and there's water leaking, and the world has been destroyed. And oh boy, what's the new? My crap! I've played Infinite. What's the name of the city you're in? Basically, you're in a city literally in the clouds this time. You're in this floating, like, utopian city. Everything's bright and beautiful, and of course, there's horrible things lurking under the surface, but completely different. So,
Columbia.
That's another great example of that. Basically, that they had winnowed down to the point where they needed to make a change, and did, and like I said, they still understood the core concepts of what made BioShock good. Like I said, which were those narrative pieces. It was the dystopianness. It was the really challenging ideas. It was the politics, and the really deep character-driven stuff that makes you think. And they killed it. And Infinite is, like I said, considered one of the best games of all time, along with its predecessor.
Yeah, so it does seem like we're onto something when we talk about, needing to either take something away and add something new, or if you can't do that, then augment the gameplay in a way that is going to kind of change the genre and the feel of the game a bit.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see what else we got.
Do you want to talk a little bit? I think Pokemon would be such an interesting discussion to have with you.
There. Yeah.
So when we were talking about Pokemon, Greg, you brought it up as an example of sequels just kind of adding more, and also a series where it kind of peaked in the second game. Like Gold and Silver and their remakes are much beloved by Pokemon fans. And the games following that, I would say they vary in popularity. Some are really popular, some are less. But
I feel like that's been a weird series, and it's gone up and down. Where there's it's kind of like when a new Pokemon game comes out, you're not like, you have no idea. You're like, is this one going to be good? I don't know. We'll find out.
Exactly.
Could be fantastic. Could be like fine. Could be actually kind of sucky.
But that's an example where when they change, obviously they have the remakes now, which can confuse things a bit. So you got Heart Gold and Soul Silver and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, but when you actually are making the new games that aren't remakes, you're adding more Pokemon, which does just feel like adding more, right? So strictly speaking, the games are just expanding, and we've already talked about how that can be problematic because you kind of lose what makes the game essential. But I wanted to make the point with Pokemon that built into the essence of the game is already this idea of a Pokemon collective, and that actually expanding that collective, I think you have more room to expand that collective because it's already just an idea within the game of there being lots of different Pokemon.
Right, like, that's one of the core parts of it.
Even in the first game, like you had 150 Pokemon, where like first of all you probably weren't going to catch them all unless you were really committed, and you certainly weren't going to have that many on your team, right? You could only have like what was it, 6? Yeah, on your team, and so like you're already selecting a subset from a massive pool. Like you're talking about less than 10% of the Pokemon are with you at any given time, and so making it so that only 1% of the Pokemon are with you at any given time, it's not like a huge conceptual leap, I don't think.
Right. Yeah, totally. And I think, too, the key thing with that, too, with the more is that, as with anything, I want to make the point, too, that more not necessarily bad, like in a mathematical sense,
Right.
It I think tends to be because it's easier to do, and does not require the quality coming along with it. Like The Witcher 3 being one of the most celebrated games of all time, is definitely more than 1 and 2. And obviously it was a prime example of how that can be done well. Similar to, like I said, some of the Assassin's Creed games suffered from that in the exact same way. And didn't go that way.
And so, to your point, like with Pokemon, not all the new Pokemon were good. Like some of them were pretty bad.
Basically, that was the difference, right? Is that once we got getting to the point where the new no one was angry about new Pokemon. I don't think. I mean, some people probably just in terms of like just nostalgia, but when they stopped being good is when people, and that's the thing. Like the good Pokemon from the new Pokemon are still beloved, right? Like that they've still come out with ones in future gens that are now really recognizable. I mean, Greninja was voted the most popular Pokemon of all time, above Charizard and Pikachu, which is insane.
Wow, that is insane.
Yeah, it kind of made me sad actually. But anyway, point is that's. Good Pokemon are good, right? It's just the thing we started doing chandeliers and ice cream cones, and that's not good.
It's a trash can, but with eyes.
I know. Actually, is that one of them?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, there is a trash can.
So that's kind of the classic one. But in general, that's the point. And you brought up a good point too, Mark, which was that was just part of the collection mechanic, but there also reached a point in the gameplay mechanic. In terms of the core gameplay of the Pokemon battles that got too overbloated too, and that seemed to have found a sweet spot in the middle of probably about the middle. Like I think a lot of people like Gen 2's remake because Gen 2 was the best place for the story and the Pokemon and the setting, and then Gen 4, which was when they remade it, was the best mechanical system that they did. And so there's kind of this perfect marriage of the best mechanical system and everyone's favorite Pokemon as well. But yeah, eventually that got out of hand, right?
Yeah, I mean, when you start talking about originally, you just had your Pokemon, right? And you could teach your Pokemon different moves, and that was
barely,
all the customizability, right? So when a Pokemon learned a new move, you could decide, or had the option, it evolved to a new level, and you could decide, first of all, do you want to evolve it or not? And second, do you want to learn this move? And that was kind of the customizability with your characters. You could, feed them Actually, I don't think there were permanent stat changes in the first Pokemon. So that was pretty much it with customizing
rare
your
candy,
characters.
basically.
So you got RNG when you caught the Pokemon that determined its base stats. And then from there, it just strictly leveled up and you could choose the moves. So moving on into the later games, like think about you can have Pokemon hold things that do different things depending on, what the item is that they're holding. The really early ones are like berries where the Pokemon can heal itself. But you've also got things where like they'll share experience with the other Pokemon. You've got things like they can't be, put to sleep.
Augment different moves.
Yeah, exactly. Make fire moves more powerful.
And then you have, like weather conditions, right? Eventually happened, and those can be changed by certain moves even within the Pokemon. Like certain Pokemon can change the weather.
Yeah, and then that will affect the stats of that Pokemon. Or
you have dual fights.
Yep, team fights are another dimension of complexity.
Right, exactly. And then, what else?
You've got the Mega Evolutions that came in, fairly recently, within the last 5 years. They added Mega Evolutions, which are like kind of sometimes evolutions. They aren't permanent the old ones. Yeah. So they're kind of another option available to you to go into the Mega form. So, and I think they may have started doing like trainer items too, where there are certain trainer items that interact. So
and I think that's actually so. Just as a kind of a side, there's a little bit of a degradation, but or digression rather. But I think the Mega Evolution is interesting as a concept because everything else we've been saying has been basically just additive, right? Like it's a new thing and there's more complexity to it. Mega Evolutions is additive too, but it also works back. Like it doesn't require new Pokemon. In fact, you can go back to your old ones that you love so much, and have them be new. Like basically, I was thinking like, okay, so what are you supposed to do with Pokemon then? Like, how do you keep on pushing the series forward?
Right.
In its current form, and I don't know. That's really hard. I think it's really really hard for a turn-based collectathon RPG, without just adding new things over and over. So how do you actually keep it lean? And iterate on the cool things. And I think Mega Evolutions actually isn't a horrible idea. in terms of it's temporary, it's new, as well as it utilizes old things. You don't need to... It works backwards and changes the way you think about dynamics, as opposed to introducing an entirely new one. And works with, like I said, the previous best parts of the game, which are usually only the coolest Pokemon get Mega Evolutions, right?
Right.
Charizard, Mewtwo, so on and so forth.
And
so I actually think that's a good example of a good way to add a system without it being like bloaty,
Right. And it's like it's not really hard to figure out how to use it either. Like it's not it's strictly an improvement, but it's for a limited period of time. Like it's kind of like using an ultimate in a MOBA or Overwatch or something. It's like the complexity comes in the timing more than in what is this move that I'm using. You don't really have to. It is allowed to work as sort of a trump card because it's so limited.
Yeah. No,
but
that's a good point.
Trying to figure out how to make a sequel to a game like that is difficult.
Yeah, and that's why people have been talking about basically how what we were talking about earlier with like how Zelda eventually had to kind of twist its genre a little bit. I wonder if Pokemon, people have been talking about a Pokemon MMO for ages, right? How it seems just custom built to be able to do that.
Oh, absolutely.
And that might have to be the future, right? Like eventually. Yeah, some of the if the core series of Pokemon is going to get harder, as we've been saying, either A, you're going to bloat it, or B, winnow it down to the best version of that idea. And they've been doing it for 30 years, so they're probably getting close to that. If not, they kind of did do that. You could say the same about Mario. Like Mario keeps on managing to not bloat, but also iterate on its design without it doesn't feel like Mario's topped out, right? Right.
If Mario Odyssey showed us anything, it showed that it was still perfectly capable. Keep on iterating.
I think that.
But so with Mario, what you're doing is you're changing the mechanics of what Mario can do. Like Mario, he's always good at jumping, right? So that's like
they do kind of change the genre a little bit with him too, though. Like
they do.
Keep going.
No, I think you're right. Like they are slowly morphing what Mario can do mechanically, and even how Mario games feel. And so totally. I think they could do a similar thing with Pokemon, but because they from the place where they started from was there's so many different Pokemon that have so many different moves already.
Yeah.
Adding more moves doesn't feel like making a sequel to a Pokemon game, right? Like,
Yeah.
it feels like because there were already so many that you can't just add more and call it a sequel. You need to
Yeah,
change...
that's not what we were looking for, right? That wasn't what was already reaching critical. Like that wasn't the thing we were coming up against. Is what we wanted more of. That was already at a correct mass, you know.
Exactly, and it's hard for me to name something in Pokemon because it was already so like sort of pluralistic. I guess like there's so many everything you can think of. There's a lot of it, right? There's a lot of Pokemon.
Yeah.
There's a lot of moves. There's a lot of items, and so it's just hard to know like where do you add more when everything is already a collective.
Yeah, totally. And that's, I mean, coming back to, like I said, just these case studies of classic games I played, but like Jak and Daxter and Sly Cooper did that really well in the same way, where their sequels were not. Sly Cooper was actually very simple. Its original one is completely stage based. There was no open world, and it was very arcadey actually, and that was it. And then Jak and Daxter was very classic collectathon actually, in terms of it was one of the first kind of open world adventure games, but it's very, very, combat was almost non-existent, very, very simple, far more a platformer at heart. And instead of doing those things again, which would have been a bigger, for Sly Cooper, it would have been just more levels, more arcadey stuff, bigger versions of that. And then for Jak and Daxter, it would have been the same thing, would have been more intensive puzzles, it would have been, new areas, basically, new arts, new ideas. They did actually evolve the series, where Jak and Daxter, when you moved into the future, you also introduced weapons, and weapon combat. You introduced vehicles and hijacking. Basically, is kind of people talk about it as like GTA Light, and you introduced a completely open world. And then with Sly Cooper, you did the same thing. You introduced 2 new playable characters, and as well as an open overmaps where you would find missions and do them in the overmap as opposed to portals, basically, like Crash Bandicoot. So those games did the same thing, where and of course 2, in my opinion at least, I think pretty much everyone's, Jak 2 and Sly Cooper 2 are considered the best of the series, and certainly better than the first ones, and are very much, like natural progressions there. And the same way that we were talking about, like, Zelda had to do that. I mean, Metal Gear Solid too, right? Like, Xander and I are playing, we got Metal Gear Solid 5 for Christmas, basically. Xander bought it for himself on sale, and it is very different from Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2. I've played a little bit of 2, actually, and seen 1 played, and 5, necessarily, they couldn't just keep on doing the same exact stealth third-person action. They eventually evolved into this larger kind of, you play, I mean, still third-person action with stealth, but it's now a giant overworld, and you have some other, like, resource management stuff that you get to do, and kind of base building, actually, which is really cool. It's more like kind of support and coordination. So yeah, I think games series do have to actually evolve genrely, not just, like I said, in terms of like moreness or the same genre, just better. I think at a certain point you do have to actually literally change the genre.
Start changing. Yeah, well, and I think that what you just said kind of breaks games down into 2 categories, right? There are games that are sort of ripe for a sequel, like Donkey Kong Country 1. Like it was a good game, but there was clearly things you could add to augment the game. And then you run into games like BioShock, where actually it's not that clear. Like, there weren't a lot of pain points in BioShock. There weren't a lot of like really clear areas where it's like, okay, could we just do this better?
Or like quality of life improvements, basically.
Yeah, quality of life stuff, or stuff that's like, oh, that just kind of seemed unnecessary. I never used that system. So there weren't like things that you could just take out. So in the Donkey Kong Country case, like, you can kind of just make the game but better, and really find the core of what you're looking for. But in the BioShock case, you need to alter the character of the game in a scary way, right? Because you risk losing your fan base, and you risk losing what made the game great. But the alternative is just to make the same game again, which is not really a sequel.
Right, and to talk to him a little bit more just real world outside of just all the artistic or mechanical parts of it. I mean, yeah, there's a reason the sequels work. It's because they're safe and people come back to them, and it is a money making industry. Developers, publishers know that, and so hence you see, like I said, all the serialized versions of the games that we all know and love to hate.
And so it's funny because I think after this discussion, I would argue that sequels aren't as safe as people think.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Because you really do have to risk changing something core about the game for a lot of games. Like games that have really found their sweet spot, you need to, if you're going to push the game forward, you have to modify the core.
It seems almost safer to just start over from scratch, like to start a new, basically, and then because you have so much more freedom, you're not trying to either A, top the first thing, or B, work within the confines of the system you already built. You suddenly have a little bit more creativity and ability to build something new, which of course is harder, scarier, and probably requires a completely different creative process.
Right.
But at the same time, like in terms of what we're talking about, it seems actually, in terms of if you want a quality experience or a very pure experience, it's probably safer to do that. Like you said, unless you, particularly, if games were constrained by development time or cost, and suddenly then the first one's really successful, now they have the budget to do basically what they wanted to do the first time, then that's when you get like the really, really good sequels,
Yeah, and there are a lot of good sequels, so I mean, that does happen.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're saying, is that a lot of the second games are in fact better than the first ones. But that is also not necessarily true. And I think the longer a series goes on, necessarily, like we said, theoretically it has to eventually get harder and harder to make those good, or at least better than they were.
Right.
That's the thing, right? Like, you see 2 in front of the game, you assume it's going to be better. Like, it has to be better, right? Like, there's no point in going, they can't even just stay level.
Right. The expectation is that you've made improvements.
Yeah, basically.
Well, I think that's
really hard.
That's probably a good place for us to stop. I feel like we recapped the discussion pretty well there at the end. Yeah. So, anyway, we clearly had no shortage of things to talk about this episode.
Nope.
We're not sure what we're doing.
We hit all the ones we were meaning to.
Yeah, we're not sure what we're doing next week, so stay tuned. We'll be making a new episode next week, and we
had a few ideas rattling around.
Yeah, exactly.
But I don't think we landed on a solid one yet.
You can feel free, if you have thoughts about sequels, to email me, mark@gamingmechanics.net, or greg@gamingmechanics.net, and we will get those and respond to you, and hopefully we'll hear from you soon. So, talk to you later, guys.
Until next time.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter @GamingMechanics, or our Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.